This is an experience of one of my close friends and a naval war veteran who served during the Civil War in a small island nation where the rebel force had a substantial naval presence, and in defending the seas a lot of valiant souls of the Navy made the supreme sacrifice. My friend, the former lieutenant, shared his ghostly experience with me while I shared my own over a hot cup of coffee, and from this point onwards I will use his own words to describe the encounter. Just after the conclusion of the Civil War, I was given a new assignment as the second in command of a small attack craft with a crew of 12 men and 2 officers including myself. The attack craft itself had experienced war firsthand and had many scars in the metal frame as proof. Around 10 men who served in the craft had sacrificed their lives during the course of the Civil War. The roll of honor of those men who made the supreme sacrifice is visible at the mess hall of the craft, and every year a small remembrance is organized by the crew of the craft to commemorate their sacrifice. I, being new to the craft, took up duties and as customary heard many rumors about the craft and paranormal encounters such as bunk beds of crew being pulled out or men sleeping in the bunks being pulled, but nothing of violent nature. I, being a witness to the last stages of Civil War, was also a bit of a seasoned soldier at the time and did not think of rumors much myself. My officer in command was Aslo, a skeptic, and debunked many of the rumors and generally disliked talking about them in public, and hence the work environment of the craft was maintained at professional levels at all times. The situation of the craft was like above, and as I was familiarizing myself with the craft, no incidents were reported of any paranormal nature, and all were so good so far for a couple of months on to my deployment. As duties, we were often sent to sea for routine patrols of sectors of the sea, and a usual sea patrol ranged between 24 to 72 hours. During one of these routine patrols, I was nearing the end of my watch and my officer in command took over the watch from myself just past midnight and instructed myself to report back at 0600 hours to take over from himself. With nothing much to do, I went straight to bed in my cabin in the craft, and I clearly remember turning the AEC on before going to bed, and the switch of the AEC panel was located just above the cabin door. The cabin door is always kept open as a practice passed on during the Civil War so as to make it easy for anyone to escape through the door in case of a blast or a flood. The craft had independent AEC switches for each cabin, which was one of the unique features of the type of craft I served. After a few moments I remember waking up drenched in sweat and noticed the AEC was turned off. Just then, a crew member peeped into my cabin from the open door and asked me whether to turn on the AEC for me, and I replied positive and thanked him and went back to bed. Just before I fell asleep, I suddenly got a revelation that I had never seen the crew member who turned on the AEC for me on board my craft before, nor was he in the ship's current complement at the time. I jumped up from the bed and stood by the narrow corridor of the craft and shouted at the crew members asking who turned on the AEC in my cabin just now, and nobody answered. I went asking everyone on board including my officer in command about who turned on the AEC in my cabin, but none of the crew said they were the one. I shrugged off the incident and continued with the patrol, and just as we got ashore, I mustered all the men on board and looked keenly at everybody in the hopes of identifying that person who turned on the AEC, but I could not. The man who turned on the AEC was a mystery. A few days passed, and while I was roaming around the mess hall of the craft looking for something to blame, I happened to roll my eyes over the roll of honor of the men who perished whilst serving on board the craft, and there to my dismay I saw the face of the man who turned on the AEC in my cabin, a fellow electronics engineering mate who perished at sea 3 years prior. I never told anyone about the revelation I just had, but I knew that some of the crew had already knew what really happened, but the code of silence imposed by the officer in command kept their voices at bay.